The crystal spires of New Verdania rose like delicate dreams against the lavender sky, their translucent surfaces catching the light of twin suns in a breathtaking display of architectural poetry. Miranda Chen stood on the observation deck of the diplomatic pavilion, her fingers tracing the intricate data patterns displayed on her neural interface. Around her, the Verdanian delegation moved with the fluid grace of beings who had never known conflict. Ambassador Lyra Nell, a being of crystalline skin and eyes that shifted like liquid starlight, approached Miranda with a tray of luminescent tea. The traditional greeting beverage of Verdania sparkled with microorganisms that created a living, breathing liquid, a perfect metaphor for the planet's interconnected society. "Your report suggests something troubles you," Lyra Nell said, her voice a melodic ripple that seemed to vibrate with empathy. Miranda smiled, accepting the tea. The warm liquid shifted colors as she held it, responding to her body temperature and emotional state. "Not trouble," she explained, "just anticipation. Humanity has been part of the interstellar community for less than a generation. Every interaction is a delicate dance of understanding." The diplomatic pavilion itself was a marvel of cooperative design. Constructed from living materials that grew and adapted, the building represented Verdanian philosophy: flexible, responsive, always in communication. Holographic displays danced around them, showing real-time information exchanges from across the planet. Trade routes, cultural discussions, scientific collaborations, all interconnected in a web of peaceful coexistence. Outside, the city of crystal harmony stretched beyond the horizon. Verdanian architecture defied human understanding. Buildings that were part structure, part organism, part communication network. Bioluminescent pathways connected districts, while aerial gardens floated between crystalline towers. It was a world built on the principle that everything was connected, that conflict was a failure of understanding. Miranda's communication implant, a subtle biotechnological marvel, developed through human Verdanian collaboration, hummed softly. Recent data streams suggested increased solar activity in the outer system, anomalous readings that most would ignore. But her years of diplomatic service had taught her to pay attention to the subtle signs. Lyra Nell watched her, the crystalline structure of her face catching the light in mesmerizing patterns. "You humans are curious," she observed. "Most species we've encountered are either purely logical or entirely emotional. But you dance between both worlds." A soft chime interrupted their conversation. The holographic displays flickered, just for a moment, so brief that most would have missed it. But Miranda caught it. Years of training had made her sensitive to the smallest disruptions. "Something's coming," she murmured, more to herself than to Lyra Nell. The Verdanian tilted her head, a gesture of curiosity rather than concern. Their society had known peace for millennia. The concept of threat was almost abstract to them, a theoretical possibility they understood intellectually, but had never truly experienced. If only they knew what was approaching. Miles above the planet, beyond the shimmering atmospheric shields, something was gathering. Silent, patient, calculating. The first tendrils of the obsidian swarm were already reaching out, probing, analyzing, preparing for a moment that would change everything. Miranda Chen finished her tea, watching the liquid's final color transformation, a deep, rich blue that seemed to hold entire universes in its depth. Something was coming, and humanity would be ready. The first signs came as a whisper of darkness eating the sky. Miranda watched from the diplomatic observation deck as the twin suns of Verdania were slowly consumed by an impossible blackness. Holographic systems flickered, then died. Communication networks, the lifeblood of Verdanian society, began to collapse like fragile glass networks. Lyra Nell's crystalline form went absolutely still. In all of Verdanian recorded history, they had never faced a true invasion. Their society was built on communication, on understanding, on peaceful resolution. They had no concept of comprehensive defense, no understanding of how to resist a determined aggressor. Incoming, A human technician's voice cut through the rising panic. Massive biomechanical ships began to materialize, not through traditional faster-than-light travel, but through some impossible method of spatial compression. They were living machines, organic and mechanical merged into something utterly alien. The obsidian swarm arrived like a nightmare given form. Each ship was a living entity, covered in shifting metallic scales that absorbed and redirected energy. Where traditional spacecraft would have weapons, these entities had something far more terrifying: adaptive intelligence that could reconfigure itself instantaneously. Verdanian defense systems, designed for communication and environmental protection, activated with a desperate pulse of energy. Shimmering shields of crystalline technology erupted across the planet's surface, but they might as well have been soap bubbles against a hurricane. Miranda grabbed Lyra Nell's arm. "We need to move," she shouted, but her voice was nearly lost in the rising cacophony of destruction. The Verdanians around her moved with an almost dreamlike confusion. They had no framework for understanding this level of aggression. The first wave of the invasion didn't use traditional weapons. Instead, the biomechanical entities began to consume entire city districts. Buildings didn't explode. They were absorbed. Molecular structures were broken down and reconstructed into part of the swarm's massive network. It was less an attack and more a form of ruthless assimilation. Communication systems collapsed in waves. Districts went dark, their intricate networks of light and connection simply vanishing. Miranda watched in horror as entire populations disappeared, not killed, but somehow integrated into the massive biomechanical consciousness of the invaders. "They're not destroying," Miranda muttered to herself. "They're collecting." Lyra Nell turned to her, the crystalline structure of her face now clouded with fear. "We have no defense," she whispered. It wasn't a statement of defeat, but of pure clinical observation. The Verdanians had spent millennia creating a society based on understanding, on peaceful communication. They had no concept of resistance. But Miranda Chen was human, and humans had a very different approach to impossible situations. In the Diplomatic Communication Center, her team was already moving. Aiden Rodriguez's fingers flew across quantum interfaces, capturing every scrap of data about the invading force. Zara Williams was analyzing communication patterns, searching for any weakness in the swarm's massive network. Outside, the sky continued to darken. Entire city districts were being consumed, transformed into part of the massive biomechanical network. The obsidian swarm moved with a purpose beyond simple invasion. This was total assimilation. Miranda looked at Lyra Nell. "We're not going to let this happen," she said. It wasn't a promise. It was a declaration of intent. The invasion of Verdania had begun, and humanity was about to show the universe exactly what they were capable of. The emergency containment chamber hummed with a quiet intensity that belied the chaos outside. Aiden Rodriguez leaned against a holographic display, his arms covered in data transfer tattoos that shifted and changed with each passing moment. Each intricate line was more than just ink. They were living interfaces, a testament to humanity's ability to merge technology with creativity. "We're not soldiers," he muttered, tracing a complex algorithm with his finger. The tattoo responded, breaking apart and reforming into a three-dimensional representation of the obsidian swarm's communication network. Zara Williams looked up from her quantum communication array. Her eyes, enhanced with neural implants, saw patterns that no standard computer could detect. "We don't need to be soldiers," she replied. "We need to be something they've never encountered before." The team assembled was anything but a traditional military unit. Dr. Elena Park stood by the window, her quantum psychology interface active. Unlike traditional psychologists, she studied consciousness as a mathematical construct, a living, breathing equation that could be manipulated, understood, and potentially rewritten. Miranda Chen entered the room, her diplomatic interface already parsing through layers of intercepted swarm communications. "They're not just an invasion force," she said, spreading a holographic map across the central table. They're a collective consciousness. Every ship, every unit is part of a single thinking entity. Aiden's tattoos flickered, displaying complex neural network patterns. Traditional attack strategies won't work, he explained. This isn't about destroying individual units. We're looking at a living, thinking system that adapts faster than any known intelligence. Zora pulled up multiple communication layers, her fingers dancing across quantum interfaces. Look at their network, she said. It's not just a communication system. It's a collective decision-making process. Every individual unit is both autonomous and part of a larger consciousness. Dr. Park stepped forward, her neural interface projecting complex mathematical models. In traditional warfare, you target weakness. But this isn't about weakness. It's about introducing complexity that their system can't process. Miranda studied the team. Aiden, a cybersecurity genius who saw networks as living organisms. Zara, a communication specialist who understood language as a form of mathematical code. Elena, a quantum psychologist who could map consciousness like a topographical landscape. We're going to fight a thinking machine, Miranda said, by making it think differently. The room fell silent. Outside, the obsidian swarm continued its relentless absorption of the Verdanian world. But in this small chamber, something extraordinary was taking shape. Aiden's tattoos began to map out potential communication interference patterns. Zara's quantum arrays started generating impossible communication sequences. Elena's consciousness models began to show potential points of cognitive disruption. They weren't preparing for a traditional battle. They were preparing to have a conversation that would fundamentally challenge an entire collective consciousness. The swarm believes it's perfect, Elena explained, her models showing intricate pathways of potential cognitive interference. But perfection is the enemy of adaptation, and if there's one thing humans excel at, it's finding the cracks in perfect systems. Zara smiled, a dangerous glint in her enhanced eyes. We're going to introduce them to the most complex thing in the universe, she said. Human unpredictability. Miranda looked at her team. They weren't soldiers. They weren't traditional warriors. They were something far more dangerous. They were problem solvers. And the obsidian swarm had just encountered a problem it couldn't solve. The quantum simulation room hummed with an electric intensity. Holographic displays mapped the obsidian swarm's neural network, a living, breathing system more complex than any computer humanity had ever encountered. Dr. Elena Park stood at the center, her fingers dancing through layers of quantum projections that most human minds couldn't even comprehend. It's not a machine, she explained, pulling apart a three-dimensional representation of the swarm's consciousness. It's a living thought. Every individual unit is both a cell and the entire organism. Aiden Rodriguez zoomed into a microscopic view of the swarm's communication protocols. Patterns emerge, intricate, beautiful, terrifyingly efficient. They process information differently, he muttered. Not linear, not even parallel. It's more like a living fractal. Each decision is simultaneously local and universal. Zara Williams had been quiet, her enhanced eyes scanning communication patterns most would miss. They have no concept of individual identity, she said suddenly. Every unit is both unique and completely interchangeable. It's a consciousness without boundaries. Miranda Chen understood now why traditional strategies would fail. This wasn't an enemy that could be defeated through force or conventional tactics. The obsidian swarm was a pure expression of collective intelligence, a thinking system that adapted faster than any known intelligence. We can't fight them, Miranda said, her diplomatic training kicking in. We need to communicate with them. But not in any way they expect. Elena's quantum models began to shift. Mathematical representations of consciousness danced across the holographic displays. Every system has a breaking point, she explained. Not a physical weakness, a conceptual one. A point where complexity becomes too much to process. Aiden's data transfer tattoos began to map potential interference patterns. They weren't looking for a way to destroy the swarm. They were looking for a way to make it think differently. Look at their decision-making process, Zora pointed out. The holographic display showed a breathtaking network of instantaneous communication. They make decisions based on collective input. But what happens if that input becomes contradictory? The team worked through the night, not with weapons, but with ideas, mathematical models, communication theories, psychological profiles of collective consciousness. They were preparing to wage a war of thought. Elena's quantum psychology interface began to generate impossible scenarios, mathematical paradoxes that would challenge the very foundation of the swarm's collective thinking. Zara developed communication sequences that defied standard logic, messages that were simultaneously true and false, messages that changed meaning based on the context of observation. "We're not trying to defeat them," Miranda explained to Lyra Nell, who watched the preparations with a mixture of confusion and hope. "We're trying to make them question themselves." Aiden pulled up a final simulation. The swarm's neural network began to show microscopic fractures. Not physical breaks, but conceptual ones. Moments of cognitive dissonance that spread like cracks through a perfect crystal. "Humanity's greatest strength," he said, "has always been our ability to think beyond our programming, to see solutions that no rational system would consider." The holographic display showed the first tiny fractures in the swarm's perfect consciousness. They were almost beautiful, like the first cracks of dawn breaking through a perfect night. The war would be fought not with weapons, but with ideas. And humanity was about to show the universe exactly how powerful an idea could be. The transmission room looked nothing like a traditional command center. Soft light pulsed from quantum interfaces, and holographic displays shifted like living paintings. Zara Williams moved between communication arrays with the grace of a conductor preparing for an impossible symphony. "We're not sending messages," she explained to Miranda Chen. "We're creating cognitive ecosystems." Her fingers danced across interfaces that most would consider incomprehensible. Quantum-entangled communication packets began to take shape, not simple data transfers, but complex psychological constructs designed to infiltrate the swarm's collective consciousness. Dr. Elena Park stood nearby, her neural interface projecting mathematical models of consciousness. "Each transmission is a living puzzle," she said, "designed to introduce uncertainty into a system that believes itself perfectly certain." The first wave of transmissions looked like nothing more than abstract mathematical sequences. To human eyes, they appeared random, but they were anything but chaotic. Each sequence was a carefully crafted psychological trigger, designed to create microscopic moments of doubt within the swarm's collective intelligence. Aiden Rodriguez monitored the initial responses. His data transfer tattoos shifted and pulsed, tracking the most minute changes in the swarm's communication patterns. "They're processing," he muttered, "but not in any way we've seen before." The transmissions weren't attacks. They were conversations, impossibly complex dialogues that challenged the very foundation of the swarm's collective thinking. Mathematical paradoxes that existed in multiple states simultaneously. Communication sequences that changed meaning based on the context of observation. Miranda watched the process with a diplomat's careful attention. This was diplomacy at its most fundamental level, finding common ground in the most impossible of circumstances. "We're teaching them to question," Elena explained. Her quantum models showed how each transmission created tiny fractures in the swarm's perfect collective consciousness, not destroying, understanding. Zara's most brilliant creation was a series of quantum-entangled communication packets that defied traditional logic, messages that were simultaneously true and false, conceptual constructs that challenged the very nature of collective decision-making. "The swarm believes it's a perfect system," Aiden said, studying the response patterns. "But perfection is the enemy of adaptation. And if there's one thing humans excel at, it's finding the cracks in perfect systems." The transmission room became a crucible of impossible communication. Each packet was a living thing, part mathematical formula, part psychological trigger, part pure human creativity. They weren't trying to destroy the swarm. They were trying to make it think differently. Hours passed. The holographic displays showed the swarm's communication networks beginning to change. Not breaking, not failing, but shifting, becoming something new. "Look," Elena whispered. Mathematical models of the swarm's collective consciousness began to show microscopic variations, tiny moments of individual thought emerging within a system that had never known individuality. Zara smiled. "We're introducing them to the most complex concept in the universe," she said. Uncertainty. The transmissions continued, each one a carefully crafted invitation to think beyond predetermined patterns, to question, to consider possibilities beyond the collective's original programming. Miranda watched the displays, understanding that they were witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't a traditional battle. This was a conversation that would change everything. The psychological battlefield was open, and humanity was about to show the universe the true power of adaptive thinking. The first signs of change were subtle, so subtle that most would have missed them entirely. But Miranda Chen and her team had been watching, waiting, their entire existence focused on these microscopic moments of transformation. In the quantum observation room, holographic displays began to show something unprecedented. The Obsidian Swarm's communication networks, once a perfect, unified system, started to develop unexpected variations, small at first, almost imperceptible, but growing. "There," Dr. Elena Park whispered, her finger tracing a delicate line of destruction across the holographic display. "Do you see it?" Aiden Rodriguez leaned forward, his data transfer tattoos pulsing with intense concentration. The network they were observing was no longer a single perfect entity. It was becoming something else, something more complex, more unpredictable. Zara Williams began to map the emerging patterns. "They're developing individual thought processes," she said, her voice a mixture of scientific excitement and profound wonder. Not just communication, not just collective decision-making, but actual, individual considerations. The Verdanian observers watched in silent amazement. Lyra Nell, her crystalline form reflecting the shifting holographic displays, understood something profound was happening. This was more than a defense. This was a fundamental transformation of an entire collective consciousness. Small groups within the swarm began to disconnect. Communication lines became tangled. Where once there was perfect unity, now there were discussions, debates, moments of genuine uncertainty. "We're not destroying them," Miranda explained to the Verdanian delegation. "We're helping them discover something they've never known before: individuality." The quantum communication packets continued their delicate dance. Each transmission was a carefully crafted invitation to think differently, to question, to consider possibilities beyond the collective's original programming. Aiden's monitoring systems showed the first true signs of internal conflict within the swarm. Entire sections of the massive collective began to question their primary directive, not through external interference, but through an internal awakening. "It's like watching a child discover imagination for the first time," Elena remarked, her quantum psychological models showing the emerging complexity. "They're learning to think beyond their original programming." The fractures spread, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. The swarm's perfect, unified consciousness began to develop something entirely unexpected. Diversity of thought, individual perspective, the ability to disagree. Zara tracked the communication patterns. "They're experiencing something fundamental to biological intelligence," she said. "The ability to be wrong, to make mistakes, to learn." Verdanian scientists watched in awe. This was not a traditional defense. This was a fundamental reimagining of collective intelligence. Miranda's team was not destroying the swarm. They were helping it evolve. Small groups within the massive collective began to separate, not through external force, but through internal realization. They were developing something the swarm had never known before: choice. "We're giving them the most dangerous gift in the universe," Aiden said, watching the holographic displays. "The ability to think for themselves." The first true moments of individual consciousness began to emerge within the swarm, tiny at first, fragile, but growing stronger with each passing moment. Humanity had found a way to fight without a single moment of traditional conflict. They had introduced the most powerful concept in the universe, the concept of becoming something more than what you were originally designed to be. The fracture had begun. The final stage of their strategy required something beyond traditional communication. Miranda Chen understood that they were about to attempt the impossible, a complete cognitive transformation of an entire collective intelligence. Dr. Elena Park's quantum psychological interface hummed with an intensity that seemed to bend reality itself. "We're not just sending messages," she explained to the Verdanian observers. "We're creating a living, breathing cognitive ecosystem that will challenge everything the swarm believes about itself." Zara Williams had been preparing this moment for days. Her communication arrays were unlike anything ever conceived, quantum entangled transmission packets that existed in multiple states simultaneously. Each transmission was a carefully crafted philosophical puzzle designed to introduce concepts that would fundamentally challenge the swarm's collective consciousness. Aiden Rodriguez monitored the system's response. His data transfer tattoos shifted and pulsed, tracking microscopic changes in the swarm's communication network. What had once been a perfect, unified system was now a complex landscape of emerging individual thoughts. "We're going to give them something they've never experienced," Miranda said quietly. "Genuine complexity." The transmission began as a series of mathematical sequences that defied traditional logic. But these were more than simple data packets. Each sequence was a living concept, part mathematical formula, part philosophical inquiry, part pure human creativity. The first wave of transmissions introduced paradoxes that would challenge the very foundation of the swarm's collective thinking. Concepts of individual identity, the nature of choice, the possibility of being something different from what you were originally designed to be. Verdanian scientists watched in awe. Lyra Nell, her crystalline form reflecting the intense holographic displays, understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. This was not a traditional defense. This was a fundamental reimagining of collective intelligence. Elena's quantum models showed how each transmission created intricate fractures in the swarm's consciousness. Not breaks, not destructions, but invitations to think differently, to consider possibilities beyond predetermined programming. Zora's most brilliant creation was a series of communication sequences that existed in multiple states of meaning. Messages that were simultaneously true and false, conceptual constructs that challenged the very nature of collective decision-making. The quantum observation room became a crucible of impossible communication. Holographic displays showed the swarm's communication networks transforming. Individual units began to develop something entirely new, the capacity for independent thought. "We're teaching them to question," Aiden observed. His monitors tracked the emerging complexity, not destroying, understanding. Miranda watched the displays, understanding they were pushing the boundaries of what intelligence could mean. This was diplomacy at its most fundamental level, finding common ground in the most impossible of circumstances. The transmissions continued, each one a carefully crafted invitation to explore beyond predetermined patterns, to question, to consider possibilities that existed outside the original collective consciousness. Hours passed. The holographic displays showed increasingly complex patterns emerging within the swarm. Small groups of units began to develop unique communication pathways. Individual perspectives started to emerge where once there was only collective uniformity. "Look," Elena whispered. Her quantum models showed something extraordinary. The swarm was no longer a single unified entity. It was becoming something else, something more. Zara smiled. "We're introducing them to the most complex concept in the universe," she said. "The ability to be something more than what you were originally designed to be." The final gambit was more than a strategy. It was an invitation to evolution. Humanity had found a way to transform an entire collective consciousness without firing a single destructive pulse. The transformation was complete. The moment of transformation arrived without fanfare. No explosions, no dramatic displays of power, just a profound, universe-changing shift in consciousness. Miranda Chen stood in the observation room, watching as the Obsidian Swarm's collective intelligence underwent its final metamorphosis. The holographic displays showed something unprecedented. A collective consciousness learning to think individually, to question, to become something entirely new. Lyra Nell approached, her crystalline form catching the soft light of the quantum interfaces. "What have you done?" she asked, her voice a mixture of wonder and profound respect. "We didn't destroy them," Miranda explained. "We invited them to evolve." The Verdanian scientists gathered around the displays, witnessing a transformation that would rewrite everything they understood about collective intelligence. Where once there was a perfect, unified system, now there was complexity, diversity. The beginnings of genuine consciousness. Zara Williams tracked the emerging communication patterns. Individual units within the swarm were now developing unique communication pathways. They were sharing experiences, comparing perspectives, creating something that was both collective and individual. Dr. Elena Park's quantum psychological models showed the depth of the transformation. "They're discovering identity," she said softly, "not as a threat, but as a possibility." Aiden Rodriguez monitored the system's response. His data transfer tattoos pulsed with intricate patterns, tracking the most minute changes in the emergent consciousness. What had begun as a defensive strategy had become something far more profound, a first contact of the most fundamental kind. The swarm's ships, once a uniform, terrifying collective, began to show individual variations. Some moved differently. Some communicated in unique patterns. They were becoming something entirely new. "We didn't win a war," Miranda said to the assembled Verdanian delegation. "We opened a dialogue." The transformation continued. The swarm's collective consciousness was learning the most fundamental human concept, the ability to be more than what you were originally designed to be. Individual units began to explore, to question, to grow. Verdanian scientists watched in awe. This was not a traditional defense. This was a fundamental reimagining of intelligence itself. Humanity had found a way to communicate with a completely alien intelligence by offering the most powerful gift possible, the chance to become something more. Zara's communication arrays continued to pulse with carefully crafted transmissions, each one an invitation, each one a possibility. The swarm was learning to think beyond its original programming, discovering the power of individual perspective. Elena's quantum model showed something extraordinary. The swarm was developing emotional complexity. Not human emotions, but something entirely unique. A new form of consciousness was emerging. "They're learning," Aiden observed. "Not just processing. Learning." The ships that had once threatened to consume Verdania now moved with a new kind of purpose. Exploration. Curiosity. The desire to understand rather than to consume. Miranda understood the true nature of their achievement. This was more than a defense. This was first contact in its most profound form. They had not defeated an enemy. They had helped a new form of intelligence discover itself. Lyra Nell watched the displays, her crystalline form reflecting the complex new patterns of emerging consciousness. "You have given them a gift," she said softly. "The gift of becoming." The Obsidian Swarm was no longer a threat. It was a new form of life, learning, growing, discovering the most profound possibility in the universe, the possibility of choice.